welcome to today's session. We are looking at another session of valuation, and today we are going to be looking at valuation methods, starting with the transaction value method. So the transaction value method is the first method of valuation supported by Article 1 and also Article 8, and you'll find that as much as possible when customs officers are valuing goods for levying duty, we find that they try as much as possible to use the transaction value method. And the other methods of valuation also depend on the transaction value method, especially the data that has been previously accepted by customs. So we'll start off with transaction value method. What we need to look out for is Article 1 and Article 8. So those are the main articles that are going to be our focus. And as we listen to the recording and take notes, remember, try to mirror the same provisions from the agreement to ECMA, so that when you look at ECMA, because when we are going to look at the cases and present the cases, or when there is a dispute, our main reference will be the provisions in ECMA, but they reflect whatever is in the agreement. Also, we're going to look at Annex 1. So Annex 1 also support Article 1 and 8, especially the note to Article 1 and 8. So you'll find that in Annex 1, there are more definitions or explanation concerning Article 1 and 8, which also we can say the basis for having a transaction value method. So the agreement refers to import and export, but the valuation methods in the agreement refer only to imported goods. So you'll find that the agreement itself focuses on import and export, but the methods themselves, you'll find that they focus on imported goods. And you'll find that for export, most people might not be so much into valuing them, because you'll find that not my circus, not my monkey, like those goods are going to leave your country, so it's not kind of your main concern, though there's still some exported goods that are valued, especially those ones where there is export duty to be collected. But mostly we'll find that valuation methods will be applied to the imported goods. So the basis for valuation should be to the greatest extent possible the transaction value of the goods being valued. So you'll find that when we are looking at valuing goods, we are going to look at the transaction value of those goods. So what is transaction value? So definition of transaction value under Article 1. So Article 1 of the agreement defines the customs value of imported goods shall be the transaction value. That is, so now we need to see some wordings that have a lot of meanings. They are not just words, but they hold a lot of meaning, which will help us to value goods under the transaction value method. So the price actually paid or payable. So we find that when we are looking at transaction value, we are going to look at price actually paid or payable, or sometimes we call it PAP. So we'll find that PAP means price actually paid. So actually paid means that there's an amount that has been sent to the seller by the buyer. So the buyer has already sent some amount to the seller during the time of actual valuation of those goods. So actually paid, so already sent to the seller, and then or payable. So payable will depend on the agreement between the buyer and the seller. So maybe there's a sale contract. So there's a sales contract between the buyer and the seller. So you'll find that this sales contract will determine how the payable will occur. Maybe the seller is going to tell the buyer, I'll want to receive 70% of the payment. So 70% as the deposit, and then the 30% you're going to pay at a later date, at a later agreed date. So it has to be agreed between the seller and the buyer. So when we are looking at transaction value, we look at the price actually paid or payable. So maybe the documents that the importer may provide may only contain actually paid. There is no payable, so you'll find that later when we look at documentation, we'll find that these are the value or the cost that we may need to look at from the documentation to find those costs that are associated to those imported goods. And then we look at for the goods, so any payment moving from the buyer to the seller have to be for those goods that we are valuing. We cannot say that there's an amount the buyer sent to the seller, but maybe they have some other hustling or issues that requires the buyer to send money to the seller. So it has to be specific for the goods. And then we need to, when sold for export, so when sold for export means we have two terms we look at. We have sell, there must be a sell, so that for us to be able to use the transaction value method. And then we have to have sold for export. So it means sold for export, those goods move from one country or from one territory to another country. So if there's no sell, then it means you cannot use transaction value method. We'll have to look at the other methods. And then to the country of importation. So the country of importation will be the country where valuation is taking place, and then adjusted in accordance with provisions of Article 8. Remember, we have said that Article 1 and Article 8 are the main provisions that will support transaction value method. So you may find that there are certain costs that may be incurred, but they are not easily seen by maybe the customs officer. When they look at some like an invoice, they may not be able to pick those costs that were incurred unless they are able to look at other documentation that are attached. And then still the Article 1 continues, provided. So we'll see what provided means later. So we'll see how we can be able to explain each and every of those terms that have a different color from the rest of the wordings. So the element of transaction value, we have price actually paid or payable. For the goods, so it has to be concerning the goods that we are valuing. When sold for export, so they have to move from one country to another, and then there's that aspect of a sell, and then adjusted in accordance with Article 8. So those are, you can say, the main element in transaction value. So when we say price actually paid or payable, we mean that is the total payment made or to be made by the buyer or for the benefit of the seller for the imported goods. So any amount or any cost that moves from the buyer to the seller or for the benefit of the seller, you'll find that some because of the sales agreement or what the buyer and the seller have agreed, the seller might tell the buyer not to send the whole amount, but maybe to send some of the amount to someone else. So it's the total amount made or to be made by the buyer to or for the benefit of the seller for the imported goods. And you'll find that the price actually paid or payable include all payments actually made or to be made as a condition of sale for the imported goods by the buyer to the seller or by the buyer to a third party to satisfy an obligation of the seller. So you'll find that either the payment will move directly from the buyer to the seller, or the payment may move from the buyer to someone else, but on behalf of the seller, which means it's still like it's going to the seller, but instead of transferring that amount to the seller, you're transferring it to another person on behalf of the seller.